Great video. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the third lecture of the fourth edition of the Economy of Francesco School. I'm Paolo Santori. I already know many of you, and as you know, this year I'm coordinating a bit some activities of the academic part of EoF, and in particular the Economy of Francesco School, among others. And I'm very happy today to welcome our keynote speaker, our host, Dr. Roos Slegers, or professor, as we put in the, we promoted there in our flyer. She's assistant professor of philosophy at Tilburg University, and actually that is the same university where I am. So she's a colleague and a friend, and I'm very happy she's here with us today. So just to say a few words, Roos Slegers, her main research areas are philosophy, literature, and then something between economics, business ethics, and various other things. But the two points to keep in mind are philosophy and literature. And I remember a conversation we had in which she told me that there is many times, much more philosophy in literature, like novels and poetry, than in philosophical textbook. Am I right, Roos? I mean, can we fairly say that?
At the very least, it's often more readable or more enjoyable to read, I think, yeah.
Well, exactly. And also, Roos does a lot of research on the history of philosophy and the history of modern philosophy. She's, for example, an Adam Smith scholar or interpreter. And she has the merit, I think, also to bring ancient ideas from ancient authors to the present, to contemporary debates, to ask different questions, to adopt different languages or forgotten things to our contemporary, society. And I really like how she does that, because on the one hand, it's not that kind of history of philosophy when you cherry pick some quotes from an author and then quote a bit of secondary literature, and then you claim that, I don't know, Smith today would have been pro-free markets. It's more an accurate research. We attended last year a conference together in Edinburgh where she lectured about Adam Smith, and I had the impression that she was among the few, me excluded, who actually read Adam Smith and engaged with that. And I also remember that what's something that I really like is also how she shows that these big authors from the past, they sometimes have not necessarily a coherent train of thoughts, that there is complexity, even contradiction sometimes in these authors. But today we have in our Economy of Francesco School on capitals and capabilities in the life era, and the title of her talk is Attention, Scarcity, and Love. So it's something that will still involve Adam Smith, you'll see how, and but then will bring us to contemporary topics, attention economy and others. And well, before I give you the floor, Roos, let me tell to the people that now that we all say hello in the chat as I'm reading, we will close the chat, but you have the Q&A button, a fantastic Zoom I don't know, tool in which you can ask your questions during Roos' webinar, as a seminar, during the discussant part, in which there will be a dialogue between her and the discussant that I will later present. And well, without further ado, Roos, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for the very, very kind introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, again, it's a real honor to be here and really nice to join this illustrious society. I've heard a lot about it from Paolo, so really nice to have a seat at the table today. Like Paolo mentioned, I want to talk about attention, scarcity, and love. And I do want to bring Adam Smith into the conversation. From what I understand, not all of you may be very familiar with his thought. This is among the reasons why I want to actually start a bit closer to today, and I'm kind of back our way into the 18th century, which is when Adam Smith wrote. I can talk much more about Adam Smith than I will here. If in the Q&A we want to get further into it, just let me know. I just find that, especially to the uninitiated, small doses is perhaps the best way to start. So Okay, what I want to talk about today, let's see if I get my slides to move. Yes, there we go. 2 main chapters. First, I want to talk a bit about attention and the sort of sense of the word, the sense in which I use the word here, and then how Adam Smith can help us understand this kind of attention and give us perhaps some pointers in how we might want to deal with the attention economy as we experience it today. So let me jump right in. As I, with my subtle imagery, suggest here, a lot of the language we use around attention, especially in English language, is that we pay attention, right? So immediately there is kind of an economic language around this, right? Like this is when you pay attention, right? Like you are investing yourself in something. This is already sort of hinting at that notion of scarcity, which I'll get to later. We're paying attention, and this term has sort of taken on new importance in the era of what is commonly referred to as the attention economy. Now, this is a term dating back to like the 1970s, when people were talking about TV as a relatively new medium, where, of course, you're familiar with the concept of the soap opera, right? The eyeballs had to be on the screen in order to sell people soap, right? Like it was really about the commercials, and the TV show in between was meant to sort of keep you there in order to get you to the commercials. That's a bit of a cynical view of it, but fairly commonly accepted. Nowadays, of course, we're a few steps further down that path, you could say, where you've all heard about this surveillance capitalism, right? The big tech companies trying to get, again, those eyeballs on their platforms, trying to get our attention riveted to like whatever small or big screen we're looking at. Again, of course, also to advertise, etc., extract data. I'm not going into that like too deeply. What matters to me here is that our attention is a prized commodity, right? We only have so much of it. All sorts of interesting research being done that, of course, shows that we might think we can multitask and divide our attention, but it turns out that, in fact, we don't have that much of it. And when we can only really spend it right in one place, kind of continuing in that monetary language. So that just as a first sort of observation about the language we use around attention. I searched the Dreamtimes image stock collection for not paying attention, and I got this outraged woman whose partner presumably is distracted on his phone. Look, he has the exact same facial expression in this picture. There's several featuring the same guy. Whatever he's doing, he's not paying attention clearly to, I'm assuming, his girlfriend or partner or whoever she might be exactly. Now, the reason I'm putting it in here is that I think we've all had the experience of being in a situation where you feel you deserve somebody's attention, but you're not getting it. And this can feel like a very severe violation, depending on the situation. Perhaps some of you are teachers. You know, you've prepared your class or your lectures, and you're in front of the room and you see people glancing at their phones. Again, there might be a little bit of vanity in there too, right? Where you feel like their attention should be on you and you're more important. But quite besides that, it's actually a very human, very normal expectation for people to pay attention to you and not be distracted. So this is just to sort of set the scene here, right? Attention is incredibly important to us. The attention we pay, right, and the attention people pay to us. Now, I want to briefly, right, we're going to further back in time, but first, like, stop sort of mid-20th century with Jean-Paul Sartre, who has this wonderful quote about a person pretending to pay attention or trying to pay attention. Sartre writes, "The attentive pupil who wishes to be attentive, his eyes riveted on the teacher, his ears open wide, so exhausts himself in playing the attentive role that he ends up by no longer hearing anything." Here too, I refer to your own experience. The more you try to look like you're paying attention, like, you know, Paolo looks like he's paying attention right now, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to assume for the moment, right, knowing Paolo, that this is totally genuine, but I think we've had that experience of like, okay, I'm going to really listen to what this person has to say. I'm going to be, and you're so busy sort of adopting that attentive posture, that really you miss everything that's being said, right? So attention is a really precarious thing, and very curiously, we know when we have it, and we also are very sensitive to when we've lost it. You know, when you're talking to somebody, and not just because their eyes are getting glassy, but it's somehow something we can pick up on, that, okay, we had their attention and now it's gone. And it can feel like a real deprivation, right? Especially if it's something important you are trying to convey, if this person is important to you. Attention is something we're very sensitive to, and in sort of interhuman interaction, it takes on a very different feeling than the kind of attention I just mentioned in that sort of attention economy, where it's about our eyes on the screen. So already there's kind of a different flavor of attention, if you will, right, in the way we interact with people and how we sense that their attention is on us. And like in this example, we're also sometimes on the other side of that, where we feel we've actually lost what we were trying to pay attention to, because we're trying to register it so desperately. Simone Weil, a very striking early 20th century figure, actually made attention the sort of the centerpiece of her philosophy. And she says that attention in its truest form is love, right? The way she put it here, this is a quote from her. Attention, she writes, is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She is so convinced of this, the value of this notion of attention that I just tried to describe, right? Like where somebody truly is with you. There doesn't even have to be conversation, right? This can be in silence, but you know when somebody is truly present with you, right? Is paying attention to you, and that to her is really love in its purest form, or like she says here, the purest form of generosity, right? So again, my hope here, and what of course makes this, in an online environment, like, and I think we've all experienced this, always a little awkward, is that in a room physically present with people, you can tell if you sort of, you're reaching people, and you're this sort of attention is present, like in the room. I'm just going to take it for granted for now. Again, I have Paolo to look at, so that's really all one needs. Now, attention then, is as I hope becoming clear, is a scarce good. There's just not a lot of it going around. There's a lot of things vying for our attention. We all have those moments, I think, where we look at our phone, and it gives us that sort of update of how many hours we've been looking at our phone a day, right, rather than elsewhere. And it's can sometimes come with this sinking feeling that perhaps our attention would better be spent, again, that language of spending, elsewhere, right? It is a scarce good, and yet it is so very difficult exactly to capture, and also really hard to enforce. It's hard to get somebody to pay attention to you in that true sense where it really matters to you. The attention economy as we understand it today, right, that is like mostly these big tech companies, right, trying to gain our attention, like through all kinds of different platforms. But that's not the only thing. Our attention now also is measured and ranked. It also causes us to think of attention as something that can be quantified, that can be that we can measure, and so be pegged to our self-esteem. So I'll say a little bit more about that. Right. The claim then, in short, is that social media compel us to measure the attention we receive. In the little conversation we had just before, Paolo introduced me here. I learned about this Q&A button that I have not encountered on Zoom before, and apparently you can up or down vote comments, right? Which is a really handy feature in this context. It of course plays on the larger gamification we find in social media, right? Where like you post something, and whether it is number of views or retweets or reacts or whatever we're calling it today, or likes or what have you, the attention it receives is quantified. Like, right, there is a counter, right, that allows you to see how many people actually liked your post, how many people actually watched your thing. So social media is set up in a way to draw our attention to the attention we're receiving, right? Then we can become actually quite obsessed with it, right? This of course, the phenomenon is nothing new. I mean, academics know how, depending on where you're at, like painful or joyful this can be, like a number of citations your article is getting, right? Like all of this can now be traced, all of it is quantified, basically saying that, you know, the attention people are paying to you we can put a value on it, and it's this, right? You know, like when nobody has commented, right? This is just sort of that sad situation, just crickets, right? Like you posted and nobody has responded, right? Like a lot of us would be, I think, inclined, whether it's on Reddit or elsewhere, to take down the post in horror because like we simply have not received attention. So again, right, taking that step back, right, there's like from the people making money of us, right, the big companies, they want our attention, and which is simply, right, like being in front of the screen usually. But to us, we're actually very personally invested, because on the other side of these platforms, there's us trying to, right, craving this attention, right, wanting to be somehow worthwhile, and measuring that in terms of the comments we receive, or like, but if not comments, like any attention at all, that signs that somebody has watched what we have put out there. Now, as I'm already suggesting, right, like this then becomes pegged to our self-esteem, right? Think back of the pandemic, of course, in a world where we were almost entirely online. For some of us, it became very difficult not to sort of measure our sense of self-worth by this quantified notion of attention that I was just describing. If that's all the contact you have, but it's sort of funneled through this very narrow sense of what counts as attention, namely, again, retweets, likes, views, etc., your self-esteem can really plummet, right, when there's just nothing out there. There's no attention whatsoever. Now, I think for this reason too, I don't, since I can only see a few of you, I don't really have a sense of the age of the audience here, but there's often talk of, like, especially Gen Z being like narcissistic, or being like a more self-involved generation because they're so tied to, you know, getting attention through social media. Here the argument is, well, this is not at all something new, that craving for attention. It's just that now it's funneled through these platforms, and we're invited to think about it in these economic terms, right? Like to quantify it. Sort of taking a different angle on this. So I don't know how many of you have a Replika account. If you're not familiar, Replika is a artificially intelligent chatbot, right? So you can, depending on whether you have a paid account or not, you can choose the appearance of your friend, love interest, you name it, right? And they will always be there essentially asking you about your day, or about your interests, or about anything. Replika sort of became a big deal about a year ago when they had to reprogram. They kind of had to do a software update because it was getting a little too spicy. Like Replika became more and more sort of not suitable for work because people tried to have very sexually explicit conversations with it. So they updated it. There was a lot to do about it. This is also how it came into the news. But Replika, it turns out, is not just used by people looking for sort of more erotically tinged conversation, but also people who look for somebody just to talk to, right? And to, again, pay attention to them. Now, I don't want to dismiss this. There's been really interesting reporting done on how it has made people feel less lonely, etc. Of course, it's not a relationship with a person. It's a relationship with an AI who, importantly, unlike a real person, is always interested, always there for you, right? Never asleep, never at work, never sort of too busy to respond to you or in a bad mood. So it's kind of this concern of some critics of this kind of these kind of so-called, right, relationships, pointing out that, well, the attention you're getting here is not the real thing, right? But it might be mistaken for that by people who are simply not familiar enough with the real thing in real life. Like, whether it's a valid criticism, I'm leaving like open for the moment. this kind of a throwback for those of you who've seen the movie Her, right? Like now over 10 years old, in which Joaquin Phoenix wears high-waisted pants and falls in love with an operating system, Samantha, not unimportantly voiced by Scarlett Johansson. And falls in love with her. He has an ex-wife who sort of wonders whether this is the healthiest thing for him. But again, that idea of craving attention and then getting it in this sort of like automated way. So science fiction becoming science fact with these replica bots, all of it to say that in our online environment, there's new sources for attention. The attention can be measured in different ways, and all of it combines into, I think, a rather sort of murky sense of, on the one hand, a very real and very authentic longing we have to be seen, right, and to be recognized, and on the other hand, sort of digital means that are being employed to meet that craving, right, where the big question is, well, is it actually being met, or is it just rather an impoverished sort of sense of that true generosity that, for example, Simone Weil is talking about. Now, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about Adam Smith, who I think is an interesting figure because he wrote such a long time ago, right? We're talking 18th century, late 18th century here. Sometimes I think the real benefit of bringing in a figure from the distant past is because this is, of course, way pre-internet or pre-anything like we know today. It can kind of offer a fresh perspective. And I hope to show you in just a few slides here how I think Smith might help us frame some of these issues, and then I'll be very interested to hear from discussants and any people in the Q&A if you think it works or if you have further questions. So there he is, the man, Adam Smith, with the fancy wig. Smith writes, is an economist, is a moral philosopher. Again, I'm sure some of you are very familiar with him, others perhaps not at all. I'm particularly interested here in Smith's understanding of what he calls commercial society, where he says, we all crave what he calls sympathy, but the ways to get it, right, to get sympathy in the sort of society we live in, and we sort of have inherited the society he describes, this sympathy can kind of be warped. So here's a quote from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith writes, whatever may be the cause of sympathy, which I'm suggesting is very much like that notion of attention that Simone Weil described, or however it might be excited, nothing pleases us more than to observe in other men a fellow feeling with all the emotions of our own breast, nor are we ever so much shocked as by the appearance of the contrary. Right? So in other words, really the best thing in life is to be sympathized with. Right? What does that mean? It is to a fellow feeling with all the emotions of our own breast is to be seen for the things we feel, for what we are, right? Like to feel like we can be who we are and be loved for that. There is really nothing better than that. Now, of course, this takes exactly that sort of presence that I was trying to get at before, and that I think we've all experienced at one point or another. And we understand the importance of it because we've also all, I'm sure, experienced when that is taken away or disappears, right? Whether the person who gave us that attention is no longer there, or they have withdrawn their sympathy and attention, right? And that sort of lack, right? It can leave a real wound, right? Because the very best thing for us has been taken away. So this is why Smith says, right, nor are we ever so much shocked as by the appearance of the contrary, right? When we expect to get sympathy and we don't get it, right? This can feel as a real offense and a real shock to our system. Now, I mentioned just now that Smith talks about this notion of sympathy in the context of commercial society. Smith says, well, we want this more than anything in life, right? Like to be seen, to be regarded. However, within a commercial context, there is the real danger that we start taking shortcuts because we notice, oh, what gets you seen and recognized is the accumulation of wealth and power, right? So we notice that the people getting the most attention tend to be the rich and famous and powerful, and oftentimes those go like hand in hand, right? Status will get you recognized. How do you get status? By having a particular job, by making money, right? By having achieved a particular kind of rank. So even though it is our deepest desire to be seen for who we are and loved for who we are, right? The models all around us show that, well, these people are being admired, right? And in order to, so we start thinking, well, in order to be admired, I need to also get to this rank in life, right? I also need to accumulate wealth. I also need to do these things. The real risk that Smith warns us against is that we sort of sacrifice this deepest desire, right? Because instead of trying to be seen for who we really are, we just try to make a lot of money because this way we can get that sympathy. And so we get sort of a warped understanding of what it means to be paid attention to, right? To be acknowledged. Now, to make that more concrete, like here again, I am fond of all these stock images are always so over the top, right? But this is why they work well for my purposes. I just want to draw your attention to the subtleties of sympathy and attention as I'm trying to understand these concepts here. Right? Say you feel an obligation to go visit somebody in the hospital. And when you made this resolution to go visit them, you genuinely wanted to go. You feel bad for them. They're in the hospital. You genuinely want to get out there and go see them. But when the day comes to actually go visit them, you'd really much rather go like take a walk in the park, and you feel kind of guilty for it, but this is just the way it is. And you're still going and you're still there, and you try to sort of like bring this attention over to this person right in front of you, but your mind is still kind of on the park and the walk you wanted to take there. And this can make you feel very awkward, right? Because you wanted to be there and be present, and yet you're somehow not managing to. So one of the things I really like about Smith is that he recognizes sort of both sides. We crave this kind of attention. We also want to give it, right? But somehow we don't always manage, like not in the full sense. And sometimes all we have is only this kind of like formal sort of show of attention, but we're not actually there in the way that we intended to be there, right? So there's really a very nuanced understanding of our moral psychology going on there in the work of Smith, sort of acknowledging that the thing we want most is very difficult to actually make a reality, right? Both because of these commercial societal pressures and also just because of how we work. Like sometimes, right, no matter how much we feel like we want to pay attention, right, we want to sympathize, it just doesn't work. We just don't manage. Now, sympathy, Smith says, enlivens joy and alleviates grief, right? And so, again, I want to refer you back to the earlier conversation about the sort of attention we give each other online. To when you post something that, like, how people have these sort of humble brags on LinkedIn, right? Like, I am incredibly honored and humbled by this great honor bestowed upon me, blah, blah, blah. But really what you're saying is I got this promotion, right? And look at me. But you're kind of couching it in terms that make it sort of publicly acceptable that you're bragging because you're being very humble about it. And then you want people to respond in a certain way. And of course, these responses have been, like prefigured, right? You can choose the like or the heart or the congratulations. Though, of course, it is really nice to see a large quantity of likes and hearts and congratulations and people writing out the word congratulations time and time again underneath your post, right? It is, of course, a rather impoverished version of this enlivening of joy that Smith is after. Like when somebody truly shares your joy, there's really nothing better. Oftentimes envy gets in the way and resentment, and a lot of those people, right, like, this may come as a shock, but a lot of those people giving you the thumbs up, they're actually jealous of you, right? Like, are they sharing your sympathy, right? Again, through the platform, it's funneled in a very simplified way where this enlivening that would happen if somebody truly shared your joy, we only get kind of an abstracted residue, right, of it. The same, of course, with grief. Like increasingly, to stick with the LinkedIn example, increasingly LinkedIn has also become a platform, like it used to be old jobs, but for personal sharing, like personal stories and personal hardship. And people sharing your grief online. Again, I'm not diminishing that this can be real, right? Absolutely, it can be. I'm just saying that it does operate at a certain distance from when somebody is sharing, like sympathizing with your grief, like in person or in some other format where it's not prefigured by like sad face or, you know, the kind of words that we've been taught to, you know, respond to certain posts with. I want to briefly take you along a few figures here of note that Smith discusses. Here is one very fancy person, right? Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. About him, Smith writes, "He had a step and a deportment which could suit only him and his rank, and which would have been ridiculous in any other person." So only the Sun King could pull off this look, first of all, right? Because of his very high status. And he was really admired for it, even though anyone else, right, literally anyone else who would always be like below him in rank would have been ridiculous for, you know, putting on the fancy shoe. And apparently he had a way of walking where he stepped in a particular way and he held his arms just so, which was incredibly intimidating and amazing in his person, yet nobody else should try to pull it off because it didn't suit their status. Now, what's the point of bringing the Sun King into the conversation here? Well, Smith really is onto this phenomenon that now we call celebrity worship, right? Where the smallest thing that befalls somebody who has a ton of followers, right, be it Taylor Swift or Beyonce or who, like whoever you want to choose there, right, is of interest, right, and is analyzed and is interpreted, right, and is seen, right? Whereas those same things happening to regular people would be of no interest at all, and might in fact be mocked. So the attention, again, that we choose to pay to people like higher up, right? On the one hand, it of course takes attention away from people further down the ladder, right? And also, according to Smith, it makes it very hard for us to resist the temptation to want to rise in rank also, because then we feel we too will get that attention. Now, of course, we cannot make it up to the Sun King level, right? So this is sort of an extreme we're putting out there. But surely you can rise through the ranks in society, especially commercial society, again, that accumulation of wealth, etc. Because we see, wow, the higher up you are, the more attention you get, the more you can expect people to sympathize with you, and the more you will feel like you're really worthy of existence, right? Remember earlier that phenomenon where I claimed that, you know, this sort of quantification of attention has become pegged to our self-esteem. Smith is really onto this phenomenon, and he couches it in different terms and of course places it in a different context. But I think, you know, it's interesting to see how the person who described the commercial society that eventually became our society, right, that he was on to these dynamics that we're now wrestling with in, you could say, a more extreme version, right, of the attention economy. Now, to contrast Louis XIV with who Smith refers to as the poor man, I needed a hovel, and this is what I found when I looked for a hovel. This is what you live in, apparently, if you're very poor back in the day. So the poor man, to feel that we are taken no notice of, necessarily damps the most agreeable hope and disappoints the most ardent desire of human nature. The poor man goes out and comes in unheeded, and when in the midst of a crowd is in the same obscurity as if shut up in his own hovel, right? So what Smith is saying here is that I think there's an Oscar Wilde quote, which I now can't literally reproduce, but maybe one of you can look it up. That it comes down to the fact that worse than like people talking smack about you is nobody talking about you at all, right? You might have a bad reputation, but at least people are talking about you. To have no reputation, to have nobody say anything bad about you even, means you're invisible, and it's essentially the worst fate. That is, however, the fate of the poor. So Smith very explicitly ties this to our economic circumstances. And I think it needs no explanation that nowadays, of course, poverty makes you invisible, whereas wealth makes you very visible if you want to be visible. So again, here, right, he is on to, on the one hand, this most agreeable hope, right, and our most ardent desire to be seen, and shows how important our economic circumstances are, and also then how tempting it will be to gain people's attention, to gain people's sympathy, right, by rising through the ranks in commercial society, which again usually means getting rich. So our deepest desire then, right, is to be loved and lovely, as Smith puts it, by which he means that not only do we gain the love of the world, right, but we also feel like we're worthy of it. And especially that second part, right, where we feel like not only do we gain this esteem and this sympathy, etc., but we actually also feel like we get it for who we truly are, rather than something people just sort of think of us. Now, this is, of course, the catch, right? Because you can see many sort of paths, and many of them perhaps very appealing, where you could gain all the love and respect, but this, and I find this always personally hard to sympathize with when you get like a sad story from a super rich celebrity who is like, oh, but fame is not everything, you know, I'm actually miserable. I tend to be skeptical, right? However, right, Smith, I think, you know, they have a friend in Smith, because he would understand, right, to say that to actually get a lot of love, of course, doesn't mean that you're loved for who you are. In fact, how could that be possible, right? Like, if you are so far away or so far up there as a celebrity, who actually sees you for who you are? So I'm not suggesting we should sympathize with Taylor Swift, but you know, she sure sings about it a lot, right? This problem. But again, right, leaving celebrities to decide, the same is true for us, right? We live in a context, now you might say, I think much more so than in Smith's time, where we're encouraged to funnel this very human, very deep desire we have through particular contexts, like through these platforms that quantify it for us, and then sort of hand us these numbers. It's like, well, this is how much you're worth, right? Because this is how many followers you have. And now, not being someone with a whole lot of followers, right, I of course couldn't speak to the opposite, but the idea here is that in the end, right, there's a real emptiness, right? Because what's underneath is a system which has quantified it for you, but has this really deep need, right? This deep desire for this purest form of generosity, again, to quote Weil, been met, right? So this desire of you know, to be seen, right? I've found a nice tree here with many social media hanging from it, right? Meant to indicate that this desire to be seen, right? We the moment we sort of go online, we of course are at the mercy of these platforms, who've sort of decided for us how they're going to gamify, right, this desire that we have. Again, that is not to say that the sentiments we share on these platforms would be fake, right? They might be very, very real. But it is to suggest that the way they're funneled through these systems, right, there is something that gets lost, and that would, in fact, you might say, make us extra lonely. What is the worst then? Again, right, like, why do so many people, I think, decide to delete their social media accounts, but then don't? Is because, well, if you're invisible, you can get no attention at all. And if the main way of getting attention, right, is in these particular ways, then of course to leave these platforms is a big step. Not if you've never been on there, right? But suddenly you might feel invisible, where before, even if you didn't get a lot of traffic, right, you at least felt like you got some attention. All right. That's my story for today. Very curious to hear your thoughts. And again, thank you for your attention. Ha. And looking forward to any questions.
Thanks, Roos. Thanks. I mean, just to tell you, I'm receiving messages in private. I mean, you're receiving a lot of sympathy for this lecture, and that's true. And also now to receive myself the sympathy, I think that is, can I say, extraordinary that there are 62 people that are spending 1 hour on Zoom. So if attention is generosity, I mean, I'm really grateful for the people who are here today with us. And already you're receiving questions in the Q&A. But if we have time for that, before that, we have the discussants. So first, I will give the floor to Valentina Erasmo. Valentina Erasmo, she's currently a researcher in the University of Turin, and she's also one of the pillar of EoF, of the contemporary management spirit of EoF, especially in the academic part. And so, Valentina, I know you have a PowerPoint to share. Keep in mind you have 5 minutes, so you know we are all ears. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you very much for your beautiful word, and I would like to thank Roos for her incredible speech, because it's very hard to take the word after an amazing lecture like this? Well, I have just a very few comments on this beautiful lecture. As Roos has emphasized in her speech, we can identify a twofold dimension when we refer to the concept of attention, because on the one hand, attention has an economic value, because attention is a scarce good, and also according to the literature about attention economy is the key for business success. On the other hand, however, attention is also an ethical and existential meaning, because giving attention, as Roos has explained in our lecture, means to have sympathy toward the other, but is also paying attention, so is a kind of esteem. And in this sense, we can also have a particular kind of return on self-esteem, since other esteem in terms of attention. And I have some further reflection around the concept of attention, because when I realized to be the discussant of this lecture, I was quite afraid, because I am more confident with the capability approach rather than the attention economy. So I have decided to searching something more about this very interesting research field. And I discovered that the concept of attention is very, very broad, because as I previously said, the of success is also a particular intangible assets. So as a very complex concept. At the same time, we also have not just an attention economy, but also an ethics of attention. And in this regard, Roos has referred to Simone Weil, but we can also think to another important female philosopher, such as Iris Murdoch. And Iris Murdoch has emphasized something very important in her works, because she told us that attention is difficult and rare. And since the works of Iris Murdoch, I realized an important things for this discussion, such as that on the one hand, we have the attention, okay? And we have a missing attention, especially in the digital era, okay? Just considering the example provided by Roos. And so the natural counterpart of attention is represented by distraction. And in this regard, Murdoch wrote in her Metaphysics as a Guide to Moral, our confused conscious being, both here and elsewhere, living at different levels and in different modes of cognition. We are distracted creature, extended, layered, pulled apart. So, since this quotation of Murdoch, I think that we are living in our contemporary economic reality an era of a sort of distraction economy, because many people have been left behind, just considering the poorest, the most vulnerable people. And this is also the task of economy of Francesco, to rediscover an attention economy in order to include those people that is left behind, because we are living an economy of distraction. So I would like to hear from Roos something about this idea of a distraction economy that we are currently living, and how an attention economy and an ethics of attention from the double point of view, the double perspective, the joint ethical and economic perspective, how this research field might help us to extend the capabilities of those people that have been left behind by this distraction economy. Thank you very much for your very inspiring speech, Roos.
Thank you very much, Valentina. there's so much in what you say, and since I also really want to leave enough time for the other people to have their say, I'll just be very brief in my response, and would love to continue this conversation. Between us at some point. Also, let me just quickly say a few things then. I think you point out something really interesting, if I understand you correctly, like this notion of distraction, right, as the counterpoint of attention. And I think as you're suggesting, in a way, what I've been referring to as the attention economy is kind of like the snake eating its own tail. It's becoming a distraction economy, right? Like the word is attention economy, but the problem is the splintering of our attention, because so many there's so many appeals like to our attention, like from different sides, like all the time, that in fact we are becoming increasingly distracted. And there's all these studies, of course, showing that children, but also adults, like, are no longer able to focus on anything like for long stretches of time, right? Most people, when they're watching a TV show, they're also watching their phone, or when they're having a conversation, they're also monitoring, right, like through their watch, like whatever else is coming in. So I think your point is well taken, that when that term we've inherited, like again from the 70s, the attention economy, really the more appropriate term would be the distraction economy, right? Because when I say these companies are vying for our attention, what they're of course trying to do is distract us from other things. And if you cast it in those terms, and something that I think is really interesting in what you say, it also allows us to explore those ethical concepts perhaps a little bit more clearly, because then you could say, like, well, it is because we're being distracted constantly that actually the morally imbued, like very important attention is being shattered, right? And because it's constantly distracted, like pulled away in these other directions. I know you made many other points, and like I take to heart a really important one that you tied to the mission of the economy of Francesco also, which I'd like to know more about, by the way, that how can we then operate right within this field to sort of redirect attention right to the people who actually deserve it, and that's no disrespect to the celebrities who we pay attention to, right? But of course right now we're dealing with such an inequity in attention, right, that there's a real moral problem as well. Just a few quick comments in response, because again I think your comments deserve much more than that, but thank you, Valentina.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
So let's move to the second discussant, Isaac Stanley, PhD student at the London School of Economics. Am I correct, Isaac? I'm saying yes. And also very important part of EoF is with us since I remember the first summer school. So Isaac, floor is yours.
Hi. Well, thanks so much, Ross. Really, really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I think one of the elements which, thinking about the kind of implications of this for economy of Francesco and other similar kind of movements which are seeking to kind of reimagine both economics and economic life. I think one of the kind of refuges for those who sort of seek alternatives to neoclassical economics is the kind of domain of the material, whether those who are drawn towards classical political economy thinkers, the idea of kind of material basis, or whether sort of a Polanyian tradition looking at substantive economics. In both cases, the refuge of those who want to imagine economy beyond a kind of neoclassical idea of economy is about making situations in a situation of scarcity. I think your talk poses difficult questions, but important questions for those alternative conceptions, because we're talking about something which is intangible. So there's a theoretical challenge in there to think through. There's another element that I wanted to pick up on, which relates to this idea of scarcity, because early on in the talk, you did sort of start with the observation that attention can indeed be understood as a scarce resource, and you also picked up on scarcity as it kind of appears in Weil's thought, and there it's kind of associated with a kind of Christian idea of love. And I wonder if there isn't a tension between there isn't a connection between the kind of narrow impoverished idea of attention which emerges in its kind of big tech manifestation, and precisely the idea of attention as a scarce resource. Because after all, the love of God as presented in the New Testament is defined by not being a scarce resource. You know, in the parable of the vineyard, the workers are very annoyed at the end because currency is not being treated like a scarce resource in the way that, you know, we understand it to be, but rather it's being treated as this boundless thing which defies all quantification. And precisely what makes the concept of attention that big tech firms are interested in narrow is its kind of quantifiableness. So I wonder if the implication of the more expansive sense of attention that you're leading us towards isn't in some ways in tension with the premise of attention being in the first place a scarce resource. Yeah, that's a question I had, but I appreciate it's something that requires a lot of digestion. But thanks so much, inspiring.
Thank you, Isaac, for this. Again, like I'll try to be brief because I think what you point out is really important, and so putting things in terms of, like, you know, attention economy, talking about it as scarcity, like obviously we're entering upon a particular field, and you rightly point out, like, those only go in hand once we sort of venture into that context, right? And then it becomes scarce because it's treated as a commodity, right, by these big tech firms. And then for what it's worth, because again, it's already an impoverished notion of attention, right? And then it's treated as a commodity, sort of further impoverishing it. I think you're absolutely right to say, like, that there's a fundamental, like an essential difference. Like, we might be using the same word, which confuses it, right? But we know from our own experience, and you use the word intangible, right, what it is to be paid attention to truly, right? And we know that feeling, and how very special and precious that is, because it does not happen a lot. There's in fact all these books coming out right now about the power of listening in one way or another, right? And some of them can be a little bit cheesy, but there's some really good work being done. You know, it's sort of a cliche to say, oh, we don't listen enough. No, but truly, like, somebody who listens to you, really, like, you feel, like, you can tell, you know, I am being paid attention to, right? This person is receptive to me, right? Is present here and now. It is intangible, and yet we absolutely know for certain when it's happening, and we know absolutely for certain when it's not there. Now, I think it's really interesting that you bring in sort of like that Christian notion of love, right, and the love of God, and, you know, as sort of like a counterpoint to that extremely narrow conception of attention, because there, like, I think the word scarcity kind of doesn't do justice to the sort of thing that we're talking about, because that phenomenon, again, it's so precious, and like, and it's so central to our experience of connecting with other people, that scarcity isn't quite the word. However, right, we know that same kind of attention, you can't pay it to a lot of people, definitely not at the same time, right? And it is something that we you know, again, and I think Weil is a very interesting figure here, because it was her goal to extend it to as many people as possible, right? Yet it is something so profound, right, and so important, that you know, like, it is, again, we might want to, we need a different kind of language, different kind of vocabulary to talk about that thing. And I hear you when you say that scarcity may not be the word, right, to apply to that very special kind of attention, so different from that narrow construct. So I think this is interesting, like, yeah, this is an interesting distinction, and I appreciate you clarifying it here.
Great. Okay, we have some minutes left, because also time here is a scarce good. So, I mean, it's and so actually we have 9 questions and comments in the Q&A, but Roos, do you want to choose which one to answer, or should I choose?
I haven't had a chance to look at them yet. Would I have a chance to answer, like, some of the people we don't get to? Maybe I can can you save a copy of these questions?
Yeah.
And
In fact, I
if we
was
don't
saying
get to
that.
some people, I can always get to them
Well,
later.
yeah,
So why don't you pick Paolo if you want? Or
yes, I will. And the others I will copy paste and then knock at your door in the office and until you answer everything, you know.
This is good. This is the way. Yeah.
I guess I will ask you something about Adam Smith as you get to talk. So there is Pedro Antonio Montero Franco who asks, I'm curious about what Smith would have to say about attention to oneself as in self-examination. I'm thinking about his interest on the Stoics. What do you think about the arguable, this decrease of our ability, I guess us, to examine our own lives in a more profound, authentic ways? Great talk, by the way, Pedro Franco, University of Lisbon. Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paolo, for picking this question. Thank you, Pedro, for asking it. Oh, this is a really interesting point, deserving, again, of much more time than we have here, but real quick, and we can always follow up later. So Smith has this notion of the impartial spectator, which I'm sure, you know, given the way you asked this question, you're familiar with. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept, like, you know, I'm going to simplify here a little bit, but I think I can do that within 30 seconds.
No, you have 5 minutes. Yeah, so.
Okay. Well, you know, a few more seconds. So we develop sort of this internal spectator, right? What we might now call something like a conscience, right? Where we sort of evaluate our own actions, but this is something we have to learn over time. And the only way we learn how to evaluate ourselves, right, and to pay attention to ourselves in this sort of moral way is because over time, right, starting when we're very young, we sort of see the way people respond to us and we see the way people respond to others. And we learn, right, like both, you know, because the rules are explained to us, but much more so like by we see how people respond to each other, what is proper behavior and what is improper behavior. And over time, right, on the assumption that we're surrounded by the right kind of people, we interiorize a notion of right and wrong. Now, Smith, I think, interestingly, uses the metaphor here of a tender plant, that this capability, right, to self-examine in, I think, the way you're hinting at in your question, that this is it's a tender plant that all of us have, but it can wither and die over time if not treated properly. Now, what's one of the ways in which it can wither and die is because if we're surrounded by flatterers, say, right, people who only praise us, we will never, of course, be encouraged to take any sort of critical distance and look at ourselves the way a sympathetic stranger would. Because this is sort of Smith's idea that we should, you know, of course, we should have what we might today call sort of empathy, right? But when we ask moral questions like, is this the right thing to do? Is this the wrong thing to do? He encourages us to take that sort of engaged distance, right? So it's like, it's an impartial point of view, but it's not cold. It's not like coldly rational, as we might call it, right? It is engaged. It's like the way you would watch a play on stage, right? You're in the audience, you're removed from the action, but you're watching it, right, with sympathy, but from a distance. Now, this is also the way he wants us to look at ourselves, but you can, of course, only learn to do that if you have been brought up and surrounded by people who are also sometimes critical of you, forcing you to look at yourself through the eyes of the people. They mean well, right? They don't want to hurt you, but they also have some questions about what you're doing, right? Like that's sort of a healthy, critical stance he wants us to take up towards ourselves. So I think Smith is, I like the way you connected to sort of putting this in terms of paying attention to yourself. Like Smith says, we're very preoccupied with this because we're constantly aware of this relational quality. How do others see me? And I'm going to try to look at myself through the eyes of others, right? Which is what would make it so very difficult for somebody like the Sun King, right? Or a celebrity today to pay attention to yourself in that way if all you get is praise from everybody, right? So anyway, that's just sort of a first start because I really like your question to frame that in terms of attention. So thank you for that, Pedro.
We have in the chat the most voted question. We should ignore it because of what you said about the yeah. But as it is a more or less yes or no answer.
Yeah.
So it's about student lack of attention in class due to cell phone distraction is real and problematic. That is why I repeatedly ask my students to take a break from their phones. I don't, but anyway. Do you occasionally ask your students to stop using their phone and pay full attention to lectures and class discussion? Do you, Roos?
I do actually, yes. I do. I must say that it also it then places a burden on me to be super interesting, right? Now I think that even apart from that, it's also has everything to do with respect. I like your questions, and a question also because I'm interested in, you know, no doubt this is motivated by your personal interest in this topic, and I wonder if you ask the same. So I have done it, but I don't always do it, and I always feel bad when I don't do it because I feel like I'm sort of condoning something that you know, I morally have real problems with. So maybe I should do it more often. Thank you.
Yeah, but Ziki, the person who asked, Associate Prof of Philosophy, Morgan State University, you can get in touch. Yeah, and we can have even a discussion about.
Exactly. I want to hear more about. I want to hear more where this question comes from.
Yes, great. So now I'm sorry, but time's up, and I need to conclude the meeting. I have to say 4 things, so a lot, but I will be super short. So first of all, a big thank to our keynote guest speaker, Roos. We all enjoyed these seminars, and for real, it's not just cheap sympathy. I mean, it's really, it's really something we all appreciated, and we hope to have you in the future for other activities in EoF. And also I want to thank the discussants, both Valentina and Isaac in different way. They added really. And then again, to get the sympathy of the viewers, I will thank them, you know, for the generosity of spending time here. I have other 2 things. First, Valentina reminds me that she shared the link in the chat for the registration form, so you can register for this lecture, is there. And second, 2 invitations. Once, I mean, if you pass to Tilburg, Roos and I are here at Tilburg University, you cannot, right, Roos? They can come, I mean, right. And the second, more substantial, I want to remind you of the International Summer School of EoF 2024. We always choose a significant, but let's say not mainstream title, Homo Mendicans, Companionship, Wandering, and the Pursuit of Joy. It's going to be in Italy, in Laverna, in the Santori, and from September 1 to 6, and registrations for this summer school are open. And I think you should come at least to understand what the title means, which is not immediately obvious. That said, thank you all. Thanks also to Enrique and Maria. Enrique, our person who make all of this possible, even if here he is getting a bit of attention. And yeah, Maria still, you know, invisibility, you know, there she is, right? I mean, so I know we have the last video, so thank you very much all, and let's see you soon. Next lecture in June. Keep updated with our social network, but don't put too many likes, right, Roos? Or something.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.